Alright, let's take a look at the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is way up here, and again in humans, if we're pretending this is a human, in humans the frontal lobes have a lot of important functions. First of all, part of the frontal lobe contains the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex. And these would be cells whose responsibility is to generate motion, ultimately to stimulate muscle cells. So the motor cortex has neurons whose activity then will generate motor action. But in addition, the frontal lobe has other regions that are involved in planning more complex motor actions. It is thought that motor intentions, are represented in frontal cortex. In addition, working memory, that is just keeping things in your mind so that you can act on that information, keeping a phone number in mind, or where did you put your books or your car keys or whatnot. Working memory requires frontal lobe. Decision making is associated with frontal lobes. In fact, the frontal lobes receive inputs from a wide set of brain areas, many of the sensory areas, as well as emotional areas. And so when we make decisions, the frontal lobes are integrating emotional inputs with other kinds of sensory inputs. Damage to the frontal lobe can cause, if you damage the motor cortex, for example, that can cause paralysis. Damage to other regions of the frontal lobe can impair decision making and making more complex movements as well. Personality can be influenced by damage to the frontal lobes. In some famous cases, certain regions of the brain, when damaged, can produce sort of impulsive behavior, lacking sort of the typical social constraints that the normal person is subject to. Okay. We should say also here, like in the other areas, how do we know that the motor cortex is a motor cortex? Well, again, stimulating the region will cause a person to move a limb. Recording from cells in the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe, they become active when people make voluntary movements. And if you were to lesion the motor cortex, patients would be paralyzed, the opposite side of the body. So if we lesion the right motor cortex, they would have paralysis on the left side of the body. Curiously, when you stimulate the primary motor cortex and people make a movement, they do not report that it is a voluntary movement. So the feeling of volition requires the activity of other circuitry, also thought to be in the frontal and parietal lobes. What's the evidence that the frontal lobes are involved in working memory? Well, lesions to the frontal lobe impair working memory. In addition, researchers have recorded from cells whose activity is correlated with working memory tasks, keeping something in mind. Okay, so generally speaking, the rear of the brain, and this is an oversimplification, but the occipital lobe here and the temporal lobes and the parietal lobes, again, the idea here is that this section of the brain is involved in perceiving the world. We've got touch sensory information being registered by the parietal lobe, visual information being registered by the occipital lobe, hearing, sound information being registered by the temporal lobe. And then the front part of the brain is more involved with responding to the information from the outside world. Now that is an oversimplification, because as we will learn, regions of the brain in the posterior part of the brain are also involved in motor tasks, and some parts of the frontal lobe are heavily integrated with sensory areas of the brain. So there are axons that heavily interconnect these major regions of the brain.